Ok. Doncs inaugurem formalment el nou curs de l'Escola Europea d'Humanitats 2025-2026 i com toca, abans de continuar, una salutació al senyor Josep Ramoneda, filòsof i periodista i director i fundador d'aquesta escola, i el convidat de la nostra primera conferència, el senyor Pankaj Mishra, escriptor i assagista, que ens dissertarà sobre el món després de Gaza. Com molts de vosaltres ja coneixeu, perquè veig cares aquí conegudes, aquí en el Palau Macaya de la Fundació La Caixa és aquest espai de diàleg i reflexió sobre els reptes que apareixen a la nostra societat. I m'atreveixo a suggerir o a dir que avui més que mai celebrem, o potser cal celebrar, la força del pensament, de la paraula i el diàleg en un món que ens està canviant a gran velocitat i en un món que està ple de reptes. La setmana passada, en una altra activitat que tenia d'aquí, dèiem que vivim en un món molt complex, ple d'incertesa i de molta devaluació dels valors humans més elementals. Aquest any, el lema de l'Escola Europea d'Humanitats d'aquest curs es diu Anticipar el món que ve. És a dir, anticipar-nos per poder entendre el que ens envolta, entendre el que està passant. Com us deia, ens proposem reflexionar sobre grans reptes i transformacions del nostre temps, les noves hegemonies, la crisi de les ciutats, la revolució digital, la sostenibilitat, la diversitat i la convivència. I com sempre fem, ho farem des de la pluralitat de mirades i disciplines. Enguany, a la web del Palau Macaya ja comenceu a veure alguns dels nostres convidats, és a dir, a part del començar a inaugurar amb el senyor Pankaj Mishra. La setmana vinent tindrem en Francesc Muñoz i l'Helena Ostanel, que ens parlaran de les ciutats en el tercer mil·lenni. Vindrà el senyor Andreu Mascolell, més endavant la Cristina Gallach, l'Ignacio Sánchez Cuenca, etc. I a més d'aquestes conferències, que més o menys fem els dilluns cada 15 dies, normalment, farem les 4 trobades, que són aquests espais de 2 tardes consecutives, on el que aprofundim més és amb aquesta reflexió i debat de manera més col·lectiva. Per tant, hi parlarem del futur de la Terra, el bosc, el mar i les ciutats, amb una trobada que dirigeix en Tomàs Marquès i Bonet, el biòleg evolutiu, de les declaracions de guerra, un projecte que ens ha presentat l'Antonio Monegal, sobre el consentiment, que també el comissaria la Gemma Calvet, i per últim els èxodes contemporanis amb el senyor Rafael Vila San Juan, que tenim la sort que avui ha pogut venir a acompanyar-nos i escoltar el senyor Mishra. Per tant, a tots vosaltres, a partir d'avui, us convidem a viure aquest curs amb curiositat, esperit crític i generositat, i que cada sessió serveixi per tenir un nou aprenentatge. Acabo volent donar les gràcies a totes les persones que fan possible aquest projecte, primer als ponents, i en especial a tot l'equip de la Maleta de Portbou, que encapçala el senyor Josep Ramoneda, i també em permeteu que la singularitzi la programadora d'activitats del Palau Macaya, la Sílvia Sauquet, que fan possible que tot això funcioni. I a vosaltres per haver vingut, sento els inconvenients inicials, però sembla que ho hem solucionat. Moltes gràcies, benvingudes al nou curs i dono la paraula al senyor Josep Ramoneda. Quan vulgui, Josep.
Moltes gràcies, Josep. Avui inaugurem el curs d'aquest any de l'Escola Europea d'Humanitats amb el seu format habitual d'un seguit de sessions com la d'avui, 4 trobades. El tema general que aquí hem posat és anticipar el món que ve, que em sembla que és una voluntat d'insinuar una posició optimista en un moment en què hi ha molt poques raons per ser-ho. És dir, jo no recordo de la meva memòria un moment en què tingués tant en la societat la sensació de que podia estar passant alguna cosa molt greu que fes anar tot el món enrere. Des de la Segona Guerra Mundial no crec que hagi passat això. Al contrari, hi havia alguns moments que després es van frustrar, que potser eren com d'esperança, com va ser la caiguda dels sistemes de tipus soviètic. Però en aquest moment el risc, la incertesa es multipliquen. És evident que l'arribada de Trump al poder hi té molt a veure, com diu Pankaj, Trump viu del caos, és a dir, del model del caos, i és evident també que en aquest panorama ha irromput el genocidi de Gaza, de la mà de Netanyahu, amb la complicitat de Trump com símbol cruel d'un nou temps, i estem veient cada dia el que passa sobre les barbaritats de la història, sobre els que la justifiquen. Per aquesta raó em semblava que inaugurar aquest curs era una persona fonamental poder comptar amb Pankaj Mishra. Ha publicat recentment El món després de Gaza, que és un llibre imponent que porta en si ja una projecció de futur que no trobem usualment en els discursos que el conflicte actual estan provocant. En tot cas, a mi em sembla que és tràgic assistir a una situació com la que vivim, en la que quotidianament, cada dia, estem veient sense matisos, sense possibilitat de buscar excuses, un genocidi, i en canvi hi ha una obsessió i una pressió de determinats sectors que ho neguen sistemàticament, amb un procés que insinua un canvi profund en les relacions de poder al món, qui mana al món, i, evidentment, un canvi profund en els mecanismes de comunicació del món en el pas en aquest espai encara de difícil gestió, que és l'espai de la comunicació digital. Estem, doncs, davant d'una falla traïdora de la història de la humanitat recent. I aquí tenim el Pankaj Mishra, que li agraeixo molt que hagi acceptat la nostra invitació, perquè ell hi posa perspectives que no són forçosament les que venen dels tòpics. Ell té una visió més complexa, allunyada del simplisme de la tradició occidental, i té, a més, una capacitat de detectar aquells elements que potser a nosaltres ens escapen. En tot cas, em sembla que té molta raó quan diu que Israel és l'última esperança del supremacisme blanc i que sembla quasi ben impensable que haguem arribat a una situació en què els enemics mortals dels jueus, és a dir, el nazisme i l'extrema dreta, en aquest moment siguin els defensors d'Israel. Moltes gràcies, Pankaj, per estar aquí amb nosaltres, i ara et toca a tu.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming, and thank you, Joseph, for this introduction. I think when I was writing this book that is titled The World After Gaza, it became very clear to me that the world that will exist after this extraordinary onslaught on Gaza would be defined primarily by lawlessness. It seemed to me that Israel had staked its future on lawlessness, on continued lawlessness, and not just its own lawlessness in the region, attacking several countries at the same time, stealing land in West Bank and Gaza, but also lawlessness in the countries that were supporting Israel. Because it was only through a continued regime of lawlessness that Israelis could do what they wanted to do, and also at the same time get away with it. So it was important not only for the Israelis to behave lawlessly, but it was important to deprive institutions like the International Criminal Court, the International Criminal Justice, NGOs like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, various other UN agencies. The attempt was to deprive all of them of legitimacy, authority, credibility. So in that sense, people keep asking me in what way is this mass atrocity different from what is happening in Sudan, Myanmar? It's a very cheap question, and it's always meant to imply that you're criticizing Israel because you're anti-Semitic. But I think what Israel is doing, it's very clear, concerns all our societies. It is profoundly devastating the international architecture of norms and laws that was put in place after 1945, in some places immediately after 1945, in other places long after. But there was an idea, at least, even in places where it came long after, such as Spain or Portugal, there was an idea that these are the norms, these are the laws we should embrace. Today, that entire system is being destroyed. And so I cannot, as Josep pointed out, underestimate in any way the utmost gravity of this situation, also the unprecedented nature of it. I wanted to talk today about some aspects of this dismantling. What has happened, especially in the last few months, what are the certainties that we possessed after 1945 that are being destroyed today? And I think perhaps by diagnosing some of these ideas and convictions that are under threat today, perhaps we can come to a better understanding, a more unillusioned understanding of what they actually were and why they were so powerful once upon a time. And I think one of those ideas is the idea of the West. Ursula von der Leyen said a few weeks ago that the West no longer exists. Now, I don't think it's necessary to understand what this president of the European Commission means by the idea, by the West. We don't have to understand that, but we can see very clearly that a very powerful idea once upon a time is in a state of rapid collapse. Thanks to what Israel is doing, thanks to what Trump is doing. Now let's examine this idea. This idea was actually created during the Cold War, largely by American politicians and commentators who insisted that it was founded in traditions of democracy, rule of law, human rights. And there was much evidence to support this assertion at the time. In the post-war era, the United States was helping to install anti-fascist, anti-Stalinist constitutional structures in Germany, Italy, Japan. And its big intellectual industrial complex, its newspapers, its magazines, its think tanks, they were all producing a very optimistic account of the world in which the moral arc of the universe was veering away from the aberrations of Nazism or communist totalitarianism and bending to an American-style free society. In this particular account, Auschwitz and the Gulag were the extremes of modern evil, not, by the way, Hiroshima. And these evils were to be preempted by full education in the horrors inflicted by the radical left and the radical right. So Stalinists and Nazis. These evils were also meant to be preempted by international institutions, as I mentioned, enforcing some legal laws and norms, embodying the resolve, never again. The re-eruption of barbarism in the heart of the modern West today, in the very democracies, the so-called advanced democracies that claim to have won the Second World War, that is, in a way, exposing just how many different denials there were in this narrative about the West, about this so-called free world, not just Hiroshima. Certainly today, there are very few believers in the idea, the post-war conviction, that progress is the destiny of humankind, realized by American breakthroughs of capitalism, democracy, technology. This is an extraordinary event, too, that we've lost sight of this idea of progress, of a better future. And something else has happened. Once this better future becomes implausible, starts to look like a fantasy, then the past starts to become another country. It starts to look like the place where the madness of the present, the derangements of the present, were gathering all along. I'm reminded, I was thinking when I was writing this lecture of some similar reflections by various writers and artists after the First World War erupted. And you'll remember, again, it's a cliche to say that the First World War came as a huge shock to many Europeans because it was preceded by a long period when Europeans, some of the most distinguished Europeans, believed that they were continuously progressing and the world was becoming a better place. And then came this 4 years of endless, mechanical violence. Millions and millions of people killed for no real good reason at all. And that, I think, for many people, from Rilke, the poet, to Henry James, the Anglo-American novelist, Freud, came as a great shock. There's a letter that Henry James wrote in 1914, soon after the beginning of the First World War, where he said, "The plunge of civilization into this abyss of blood and darkness is a thing that so gives away the whole long age during which we had supposed the world to be becoming a better place." There is another line which actually really haunts me from Freud, from 1916, from a wonderful essay I would strongly recommend, titled On Transience. Very unlike anything he ever wrote, very literary, very heartfelt, where he describes a conversation with a poet, and I think the poet is Rilke. And he says that a war that was applauded by so many intelligent writers, artists, had not only destroyed, wonderful works of art, churches, whole towns, whole cities, but it had shattered our pride at the accomplishments of our civilization, our respect for so many thinkers and artists, our hopes of finally overcoming the differences between peoples and races. How this war had showed us the fragility of so much we had considered stable. I think today, in many ways, a much more spectacular display of cruelty and hatred, deliberate cruelty and organized hatred, has or is damaging a very sense of self, a very sense of possibility. And you have to remember this sense of self and possibility is always sustained by a small faith in our societies getting better, more liberal, less full of hatred, less bigoted. And so just in the last few months, so many ideas, individuals, institutions that seem to be advancing moral progress have lost their authority and their prestige. There's so many examples. I will just name a few of them. You'll remember the name Simon Sharma, distinguished art historian, Jewish historian, who also wrote wonderfully about Jewish history. It would be difficult to read him today without recalling that precisely when the Palestinians were being slaughtered on a daily basis, hundreds and hundreds of them, he tweeted an internet theory saying Palestinians have a conspiracy to take over the world. Just a few weeks ago, when starvation was being fully documented by various organizations, he again put out a conspiracy theory saying essentially there is no starvation in Gaza. University of California, Berkeley, once the home of the free speech movement and the home of the counterculture in the 1960s, today rushing to offer a list of 160 anti-Semitic students and teachers to the Trump administration, including, by the way, Judith Butler. So this, among the many things that we have to re-examine is this history of eternal persecution and victimhood. This meaning of Jewish history, which used to be very clear once upon a time, but is no longer very clear. It cannot be clear when the state built to prevent the recurrence of murderous anti-Semitism perpetrates a genocide with the help, as Joseph pointed out, of anti-Semitic Christian nationalists in the United States. The Holocaust itself no longer seems an instance of demonism on a different scale altogether. You'll remember it was planned and implemented in secrecy. The Nazis wanted to hide the evidence. Today, we are seeing the first televised mass extermination with the Israeli population applauding what is happening, fully supporting the starvation of Palestinians, and cheerleaders around the world, deniers in this country, and cheerleaders many other places, like this Democratic senator who goes around in a hoodie and shorts, even to the US Congress. Fetterman. I think these events, the cheerleading of a genocide, they speak today much more persuasively of the sheer potency, the pervasiveness, and what Hannah Arendt called the banality of modern evil. What's also worth remembering is this evil was not checked by an education in the horrors of the Holocaust. It has actually been encouraged by this education in the horrors of the Holocaust. So there are other things we had taken for certainties. All of these things that together define the West, define collective identity, individual identity after 1945. This includes the discourse of human rights, which was constantly invoked in the Cold War against communism, and also various hot wars against Muslim countries in recent decades. This notion of human rights, you'll find it in various American scorecards, report cards on countries around the world. It was used to impose sanctions on those countries and to bully them. It's now very clear that those who were defining human rights in a very narrow way as civic and political rights rather than economic and social were basically using it to coerce and bully anti-American governments and movements abroad. They were weaponizing human rights, and they had no interest in, they were deliberately ignoring what was happening at home. The big widening abyss between the rich and poor, the absence of basic rights to social security, healthcare for Americans, and of course the manipulation of the democratic process by corporate money. All of this, the discourse of human rights missed. But no pillar of this post-war intellectual and moral order today looks as weak as anti-totalitarianism. This negatively defined liberalism that made American and also Israeli democracy look superior, much, much superior to their supposed enemies. What this anti-totalitarian liberalism was doing, I hope to point out, was not only concealing the structural defects, the historical crimes of both American democracy and the Zionist state, but also, very importantly, incriminating anti-totalitarian liberals in what is now a near total breakdown of political and moral norms. I want to give a little bit of a background to this idea of totalitarianism, which we must now reckon with in a very different context, that the context of the West. Many Western thinkers concluded after the exposure of Hitler's and Stalin's crimes that a completely new kind of thinking was necessary to grasp the radical novelty of these crimes. This old faith, the Enlightenment faith in human reason, science, and free speech, had already been weakened by the First World War. But after 1945, it looked completely devastated by this unprecedented bureaucracy of mass death, which was sustained, as we know, by modern technology, systematic lying, deceit, and also widespread public gullibility, and not just gullibility, but very eager acquiescence. So everything that we see today. Albert Camus, someone I've been rereading a lot recently, was among these intellectuals who were driven to understand what he called the culpability of a period which within 50 years uproots, enslaves, or kills 70 million human beings. He had a very basic question to ask, that what happened to human judgment? In the past, when tyrants used to raise cities for their own glory, human judgment judged those crimes, was very clear about what was happening. Why human judgment had become crippled before the much bigger criminalities of the modern era. His idea was that it's because the people perpetrating these crimes had very good reasons to offer, and those reasons were, we have a vision of a just society, of the good life, and we are going to realize that vision, even if it means committing a few crimes. So they had perfectly rational explanations for mass murder. And it's with these explanations that we saw this peculiar violence of the 20th century, where you had slave camps, but under the flag of freedom, as Camus put it. Massacres justified by philanthropy, something Netanyahu does all the time when he says he has to do all this because he's defending Western civilization. Hannah Arendt was also another writer alert to these perversions of language and logic that accompanied what she called the mass production of corpses in the mid-20th century. She traced the origins of totalitarianism to the 19th century, probably the first Western thinker to do so. She examined how these racial ideologies of endless aggrandizement emerged in 19th century Europe and seduced its best minds, those she called the tragic fools of imperialism. In many ways, what Israel has gone back to is this 19th century social Darwinism of European empires. Might makes right. Whoever wins can justify anything, even the worst crimes. Now, many victims of imperialism in Asia and Africa already had an intuition of just how powerful white men from Europe obscured their worst excesses from genocide, slavery, famines, despotism. They all justified those by presenting themselves as philanthropists who were in the avant-garde of humanity's march to a glorious future, and these Asians and Africans needed to be educated into joining that march to a glorious future. So they were not fooled by any of these particular claims that started to be made for these extraordinary crimes in the 19th century. Nor was it lost on them that even the most self-consciously liberal and cosmopolitan of modern Western writers and intellectuals affirmed racial hierarchies. John Stuart Mill flatly declared barbarian peoples such as Indians unfit for self-rule. Charles Dickens, famously caring about children in particular and poor white men, he demanded the extermination of the Indian race after a violent uprising in 1857 against the British in India. So because of all these events and beliefs and statements, many Asians and Africans were not inclined to believe that Western liberal democracy, or this West as it was described, was by definition antagonistic to totalitarianism. Gandhi, who said many things about this subject, he used to always say that there is no democracy in the West. It's captured by special interests, and it gives moral cover to the extreme violence unleashed by capitalism. So parliament was compromised, newspapers were dishonest, they were all serving the needs of capital. And this is not a Marxist. He just had a different kind of perspective on this. One very interesting prediction he made in 1938, which was that these nominal democracies of the West, as he called them, were very likely to become frankly totalitarian because they could not keep up this violence for too long. The violence was going to conflict with democratic sentiments, and violence would be used systematically to destroy those democratic sentiments, very close to what is happening in the United States today. There were many other anti-colonial activists, George Padmore, Amy Césaire, and various others who said similar things. And there were obviously, as I said, similar such analyses from people like Hannah Arendt, Simone Weil, very alert to colonialism. All of that should have discouraged too relaxed a conscience among the victors of the Second World War. It should have opened up a broader inquiry into the barbarism inherent in political and economic modernity. There's a wonderful speech by Camus, which he gave in New York in 1946, where he tells his American audience not to feel too good about what has happened with their victory in the Second World War. He said, "The poison which impregnated Hitlerism has not been eliminated. It is present in each of us." A year before, he had described Hiroshima as our technical civilization reaching its highest level of savagery. But I think, someone like him was not listened to, especially in the United States, because that whole tradition he belonged to in Europe, this intellectual self-questioning and artistic experimentation that began in Europe after the First World War, never found fertile ground in the United States. The United States grew richer and more powerful after these two world wars. And so it never produced thinkers, figures like Camus or Hannah Arendt or Paul Valéry or Robert Musil or Jacques Maritain. These were all Europeans who were forced by their traumas to examine their utopian ideas, their confidence that Western prescriptions of democracy or science or communism or free trade would achieve a glorious future. So the American Cold Warriors, the American nation builders in Italy and Germany and Japan were almost entirely troubled, entirely free of self-doubt. And they found it much easier to establish this idea of the West as a common identity for both the old white masters of the universe who had been discredited, the English and the French, and of course also the Germans, but also create a new identity for these emerging masters of the universe, which were the Americans. Totalitarianism for them was something very crudely defined, something that they could use to identify the perceived enemies of Western interests, whether Mao Zedong in China or Osama bin Laden more recently. The idea was to furnish the United States and these discredited European empires with a flattering self-image and lofty moral mission. So even Germany, very quickly, with Nazis still influential in the public life of Germany, and of course Spain, still under a fascist regime, could be accommodated in this anti-totalitarian community. And there were historians and intellectuals, German historians, who were arguing that Nazism and fascism were basically consequences of Bolshevism. There were various other narratives who were making a case for a Judeo-Christian civilization. This is an idea that really took off during the Cold War. And then, of course, there were these very powerful accounts of brutal repression in the communist countries by dissident writers like Czeslaw Milosz, The Captive Mind, and Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, which, if you read them back then, made the Western alternative look effortlessly superior. Very little attention was given to the fact that these dissidents themselves, Milosz, Solzhenitsyn, many others, were, when they came close to the West, were profoundly disturbed by some similarities they saw between the so-called unfree world and the free world. Milosz, who was in the US for the first time in the 1940s as a Polish diplomat, wrote to a friend in a letter. He said, Americans have a cow-like existence. They live in a regime of propaganda and lies. And the means by which public opinion is molded in countries like Poland was really child's play compared to the art form the Americans had developed. Solzhenitsyn, when he came to America, was shocked by the conformity of the American press. And eventually said that what's terrifying is not this nuclear confrontation between these two superpowers, but the similarity of the disease afflicting these two sides. Václav Havel went further, writing from a communist prison in Prague in the 1980s. He warned the emerging victors of the Cold War that they would resemble, as he put it, their defeated opponents far more than anyone today is willing to admit or able to imagine, and that the West would eventually construct its own gulag in the name of country, democracy, progress, and war discipline. There are many, many other examples. Calvino, who went to America in 59-60, wrote to a friend saying, here we are in a totalitarian structure of a medieval kind, based on the fact that no alternative exists to capitalism, nor even any awareness of the possibility of an alternative. I think this kind of blinding Cold War structure became more and more dominant after victory in the Cold War, when history itself seemed to end in American-style democracy and capitalism all over the world. There was no other trajectory. So many writers and thinkers who were enlisted by that time into the privileged classes of the United States resurrected this political utopianism that had been abandoned in Europe, that had been abandoned by people who saw where all this led to. These people who were ensconced in very well-paid jobs in Ivy League universities, in think tanks, it was almost imperative. It was almost a question of their career and income to hail the United States as a nemesis of totalitarianism worldwide. You have figures like Samantha Power writing a book where she said the United States should intervene in genocide, wherever it sees genocide happening, the United States should intervene on the side of the weaker party and stop it. After 9/11, when first Al-Qaeda and then Saddam Hussein emerged as incarnations of a new totalitarianism, they were described as such over and over again, new Islamic totalitarianism, Islamofascism. You had figures like Michael Ignatieff, many others. There were so many others, but these are really sort of interesting cases of liberals who were arguing that the United States should become a new empire, should assume its obligations as an empire, and impose democracy and human rights and free trade through war if necessary. I think what's becoming clear today when we look at the world after Gaza, and I think it was becoming clear even before a gulag was opened by the United States in Guantanamo, under the banner, you'll remember, of enduring freedom. It was becoming clear that a very cartoonishly cruel and incompetent communism had made for terrible intellectual complacency among its Western enemies. In that sense, the so-called West, or the so-called free world, had been very fortunate in its choice of enemies. But at the same time, that good fortune had meant that there was very little rigorous thinking about a range of issues that we are now forced to reckon with. These fools of 21st century Western imperialism that I've just mentioned, if you look at their works, there is very little of the historical literacy, let alone the moral sophistication, of someone like Camus or Arendt, they were dazzled by their own image as philanthropic guides to humanity. And as such, they were doomed to repeat that grotesque logic that Camus identified of slave camps under the flag of freedom. You remember some of these flagship periodicals of American cosmopolitanism, the Newsweek or Time, the Atlantic, did not hesitate to ponder the uses of torture after 9/11. There are still cover stories out there of these magazines, the so-called liberal magazines. So when we think about what Trump is doing today, let us remember what happened 20 years ago. Ignatieff, who was a Harvard professor of human rights, actually offered a recipe for permissible duress in the pages of the New York Times Magazine. What has happened, of course, is that it's not a totalitarian from Baghdad or Kandahar or Kabul who has proven to be the nemesis of this so-called West that these liberals were supporting. It's a man from the Bronx. It's Trump who incarnates this will to power. And he exercises it today without shame at the expense of weaker, often darker peoples. It's worth thinking about this sinister achievement of Trump. He has discredited the old intellectual and political establishment thoroughly. They will never return. At the same time, he has cemented the racial hierarchies and regimes of repression, including extrajudicial execution, torture, all of the things that were legitimized by this establishment during the War on Terror. What's also interesting is that his parody of these people who wanted to save the world with American weapons or through American charity, his parody has reached such a grotesque point that as a white supremacist president, he still wants to be seen as the authentic savior of a world at war. He wants the Nobel Peace Prize. So this Western liberalism that was too dependent on monsters abroad turns out to have been a moral mask for a service class of intellectuals, a kind of fashion accessory that has been ripped off by Trump because it is absolutely of no use to those who are presiding over a swift and brutal reversal of racial progress in the United States today. I think many of us are surprised how quickly the 19th century crude idea that white men should dominate inferior Africans, Asians, and Pacific peoples also should dominate women, how it has returned to the mainstream of Western policymaking and journalism. The subterranean stream of Western history has finally come to the surface, Hannah Arendt warned, in 1950, after the 19th century ideologies of racial aggrandizement achieved a monstrous culmination in the very heart of Europe. That subterranean stream has again come to the surface in 2025 with much more force, with much more violence. And it's really sweeping away a once very powerful or once very unchallengeable idea of the West. But I would go even further when I think about the world after Gaza, I would say that we had really sort of lived all this time and done so much of our work with the assumption that the gates of hell, which had been shut and locked after the exposure of the Holocaust and after the exposure of Stalin's crimes, I have a feeling they are being opened again. Thank you.
Moltes gràcies, Pankaj. Hi ha moltes coses per les que voldria entrar, però hi ha algunes que em semblen fonamentals com a punt de partida. Una d'elles és aquesta idea de fons de que en la humanitat hi ha unes corrents que condueixen per la via de la sobreactuació del poder inexorablement a formes de totalitarisme que muten, van d'un cantó a l'altre, però que hi ha una certa continuïtat en aquest procés. Estaries d'acord amb això?
Oh, absolutely. I think that was the main insight of the people who first examined this new form of political power. That this is not something peculiar to the regimes in Italy or in Germany, that it has an older history, and that we must understand the construction of concentration camps in South Africa in the 19th century. We must understand the history of European colonialism in order to understand these modes of despotism. We must understand the rhetoric of racial dehumanization that was perfected in the 19th century and was indulged in by famous writers and intellectuals, how this has been entering the mainstream of Western politics, economy, over a longer period. And what we see in Italy and Germany is obviously a much more developed version of it. But we must understand its history. And I think that fundamental understanding that was developed in the mid-20th century was crudely simplified and distorted. And so I think what I'm trying to say here is that we abandoned a very important tradition of critical thought in the service of this fantastical idea of the West, which has really is serving us very poorly at this time. We're all very confused and disoriented. We don't know whether our intellectual archive at the moment has the capacity to make sense of what is going on. To give you an example, Habermas, the great intellectual still with us, undoubtedly great, who gave us all these ideas to think about the public sphere, about communicative rationality. He was one of the first to defend Germany becoming part of the Western community. This was his big sort of, advocacy that this is right, this is correct, this is what should happen. Today, he is criticizing those who are attacking Israel. Again, I'm saying there's something has gone wrong in this Western intellectual tradition, where a figure like Habermas can become complicit in a genocide, indirectly, but yes, intellectually complicit. And so let's see what went wrong here. Did we assume too simplistically? Did we examine rigorously enough these ideas of the West that even Habermas is playing with? Has he really looked into this broader history of the West, which is not something to be confined to Europe and America, but also Asia and Africa, or Latin America, where that history of the West was played out.
El nivell en què està articulat el totalitarisme en la societat respon fonamentalment a dues qüestions, al meu entendre, dues pulsions molt estructurals de la condició humana. Una és la pèrdua de la noció de límits i l'altra, la banalització del mal. Aquestes dues figures són figures articulars de la condició humana i crec que tenen molt a veure amb aquesta continuïtat que el totalisme troba al llarg de la història.
I completely agree, and I think this is why the sort of more metaphysical aspect of totalitarianism were worthy of much greater attention than the kind of the sort of institutions and mechanisms of totalitarian society. I think not enough attention was paid to this. And again, as I said, this has really had a very damaging effect on our ability to understand where we are today, where so much of the Western press is still assuming these completely exploded positions of liberalism or kind of just repeating the same old arguments and propping up the same old figures as though they still have anything useful to say about what is happening.
Evidentment, un factor determinant és el ritme del desenvolupament i l'acceleració de les tecnologies. Això juga un paper determinant en la construcció d'aquests episodis de voluntat absoluta. Quin és el problema de les tecnologies contemporànies?
No, Josep, I think when people were diagnosing this kind of totalitarian thought control that was still in its infancy in the mid-20th century, whether it's the Frankfurt School or independent observers like C.L.R. James, the great Caribbean activist who spent the 1940s in the United States, and he was in California, and he was looking at literature and cinema and comic books and saying there's a totalitarian mentality forming in the United States. This is in 1949. So there were various people who were very attuned to the role of modern technology in creating a certain kind of subjectivity, in creating a certain kind of mentality. Today, digital technology, especially in the hands of the Silicon Valley tech bros, has an explicitly nihilistic role to play in the formation and the corruption of the subjectivity. So whether it's Charlie Kirk or the person who killed Charlie Kirk, both are victims of this sort of social engineering that is going on and has been going on in the United States for some time.
Hi ha, evidentment, el cas de Trump, que és realment inquietant i significatiu en aquest moment, perquè és la banalització de l'autoritarisme, és la conversió de l'acció autoritària en un joc, en un atreviment, en una cosa que fa riure i que distreu el personal. És un nivell de banalitat que et queda sorprès que pugui quallar amb una societat i que tingui emmordassada com té en aquest moment a la societat americana. Que es toleri amb tota tranquil·litat que el president de la nació decideixi que s'ha de tancar un programa d'una televisió o que anunciï clarament que seran condemnats o tindran alguna pena aquells que es dirigeixen críticament amb ell. Això és un nivell a la vegada de pèrdua de la noció del possible, de banalitat i d'incapacitat de donar una dimensió a la política que només pot conduir a una certa descomposició general d'una societat.
I think, in that sense, he sort of tapped into a sort of profound impatience that has been growing for some time with the deliberations of democratic politics. I think I saw this in India before Trump came to power. I think, the reason why I started thinking about these things is because a Hindu supremacist with a totalitarian toolkit came to power in India in 2014 and made me think about just why so many people succumbed to his bold, brazen destruction of democratic norms, why people would vote for him in election after election. And I think at that stage, the idea of unrestrained freedom, which he offered, and I think primarily the freedom to hate, the freedom to despise, which for many people was a great liberation from a culture of restraint, a culture of democratic restraint, partly because for them that democratic politics of restraint, of deliberation, of civility had become identified with corrupt metropolitan elites. And I think both Trump and Modi offer people the satisfaction of violating these norms, which he very carefully identifies with an urban metropolitan elite. And in that sense, I think Trump and Modi work together in offering people that kind of emotional and spiritual satisfaction almost in the destruction of known ethical norms. That it's this particular elite that practices those norms, and therefore you should violate them repeatedly. So it's a really very sinister psychosocial dynamic that he has seized upon and now uses it. And I think one thing we must never forget, that the hatred of bourgeois society is something that is very constant right from the French Revolution onwards. And I think various people have seized that particular platform. But I think in an age of immense social and economic inequality, the hatred of a privileged class, we can call it bourgeois, or if the word is too imprecise, let's just call them the privileged class. That hatred is really now very, very entrenched. And whoever takes control of it, even temporarily, stands to benefit. And this is, again, I think, something that a lot of people on the left really struggle to understand. Just how they themselves can be identified, can become identified with this hated bourgeoisie, with these hated privileges, become identified with wokeism, and that's really is a very interesting instance of conflating wokeism with this privileged elite and thinking they're more or less the same.
Una última imatge que em sembla que és molt explícita del moment en què estem, no? Que és que es pugui donar que els enemics mortals dels jueus, els feixistes, les extremes dretes, ara s'acostin a Israel i comparteixin l'extermini genocida de Gaza, no? És una paradoxa o és una naturalitat de què en el fons els totalitarismes es troben?
I don't think it's a paradox really, because I think identities are never fixed. Those who claim themselves, those who claim to be the defenders of Israel, those who claim to be Zionist, what are they actually doing? They're fighting to preserve their power and their wealth. That's what Netanyahu is doing. And in that endeavor, he is going to welcome the help of even people who want Israel to be the place where Armageddon happens. So our anti-Semitic Christian nationalists in the United States, who are great supporters of Zionism because they think this is bringing about a great prophecy in the Bible. These are embraced by the Zionist regime, not because they see that they don't see that there is anything particularly anti-Semitic about it. It's just that these people are useful to them in their own pursuit of wealth and power. So I think we should dispense with these sort of inherited identities in these instances and see actually what is really going on here. If you look at this documentary of Netanyahu called the Bibi Files, it becomes very clear that this man who's been fighting for some time to stay out of prison, who loves pink champagne, who wants to be gifted pink champagne by his wealthy friends in the United States. He wants all kinds of other goodies, various accessories, fashion accessories. This is a man who will make deals with Hamas when he wishes to, support Hamas, which he did for many years, give them money. He will do deals with the biggest enemies of Israel if he needs to. He will not care at all about hostages if he needs to, which is something he's been doing over the last few months. We should not see this man as someone fighting to protect the state of Israel or to keep Zionism alive. This is the man who is part now of a global network of the rich and powerful, and he's doing what he can where he is, waging war, in order to maintain his privileges, in order to maintain his wealth and power. I think the rest of us get too distracted by these particular histories of Zionism or anti-Semitism, and I think the actual political actors are not adhering to those identities anymore. They're broken free. They are playing a different game altogether. Even AIPAC, the Israeli lobby group in the United States, most people think they are there to defend and protect the state of Israel. The real truth, and now it's very well documented, is that AIPAC is a front for various corporate lobby groups. It's the best platform for corporate lobby groups to come together and crush the organized left, such as it is in the United States. It's the best way to destroy trade unions in the United States. And so people give money to AIPAC, not because they're interested in Zionism or interested in the state of Israel, but they're interested in protecting their privileges.
Qui s'incorpora a la conversa, potser m'he allargat una mica, però tenim estona encara aquí. Aquí, sisplau. Aquí, sisplau.
It's okay? Good. Well, thank you, Pankaj, for the very interesting, that's the least I can say. Let me try an analogy. You've been describing the 20th century as a century of empires. The most iconic being the British Empire dropping off, etc. But what you're telling us is a story about those who actually were the victors of the Second World War, which was a war of empires. The Reich was an empire, or the attempt of an empire. The Japanese was the attempt of an empire as well. And the empire that actually succeeded was the so-called the Western Empire, with all these liberal stories, etc. Then this empire implodes from within, because actually there's enough unrest, because all the expectations are not met, and then we have all this kind of internal crisis in all the countries. It's the US, it's the UK lately, in France, in Germany, everywhere. And then you compare that with you oppose West and East, but in East, we're beginning to see a sort of mirroring of that. So there's an upcoming empire, which is the Chinese, actually, playing with different rules, and basically telling us, or telling the West, that the rules have to be changed because there has to be space for a new one. So this is a geopolitical discussion. But going back to your latest book, the Gaza, at the end of the book, when thinking about the future, you seem to point to the young generation. And you mentioned something about the spirituality, dropping around. But I haven't heard anything about supporting the idea that a young generation could take the torch or say something different. The examples you've given us, Camus and Arendt, are really eccentric. These are people actually that didn't, I mean, we can read them as illuminating what's going on today, but at their time, they were not particularly, let's say, gaining followers. Neither Camus nor Arendt. They were eccentric to their community. So I'm wondering, what's in the future? What will be the hope after all this story?
I think,
if there's any.
Yeah. No, there's hope if we create it. I don't think we can simply, passively hope for hope to materialize. And I think young people have created that hope. In many ways, they are the opposite of what Tony Judt called the crappy generation. Some of the younger writers and intellectuals I quoted in the piece, these were people, he said, belonged to a generation that had grown up after the war. They had not lived through terrible times. They were historically weightless. They never faced any hard choices. So it was easier for them to drift into this, nonsense about America being the great humanitarian savior of the world. Compare that crappy generation to the generation that has grown up after 9/11. This is a generation that has seen so much and really has had a traumatic education in the ways of the world. Whether it's the war on terror, whether it's a financial crisis or climate change, the catastrophes of climate change, or Brexit, or Trump, and now the far-right surge, institutionalized, mainstreamed racism. So I think, in a way, having received this education, younger people are far, far more engaged in many countries in the world. I know that younger people in many countries, especially men, are increasingly susceptible to the far right. But in many other places, they're actually quite the opposite. They're very aware of the things that need to be done. They're very aware of the failures of the previous generation, and just what a terrible world that they have inherited. So when I'm asked about hope, I think about this generation. And already, I think, with their mobilization on the issue of Gaza, they have already shown a different kind of moral awareness and engagement, the opposite of career advancement and callousness that we've seen from people in politics and journalism. they've taken some risks, gone out and demonstrated. In the United States, they've been crushed. They have been crushed in the United States. And I don't see how the student movement will re-emerge in the United States. But, it keeps popping up. Today in Italy, you see these pictures of general strike. In Italy, you see all these young people on the streets of Milan and Rome. And again, you think something is happening here. You don't have hundreds of thousands of people filling the streets against, the Meloni regime without being profoundly motivated to change the world they are living in. So, I think they are sort of creating this hope for the rest of us to learn from, I suppose. Your other, I think the rise of China is something that was forecast a long time ago, from the 19th century onwards. And I think it was very clear that once China emerges, it'll be a very different, very difficult scenario for Western nations. Napoleon said that. He didn't have all the facts, but he said that nevertheless. Someone who also said that was Gandhi. So the quote I said about the Western nations becoming frankly totalitarian, that's exactly what he said. They will become frankly totalitarian. They're only kind of hidden, concealed totalitarian right now. And he said that it's because they're able to steal from places like India and China and keep them subdued. But there will come a time when they'll be stronger and powerful, and Western power would diminish, and that's when this totalitarian thing will happen. So it's a very interesting prediction, and it's proving to be true, because China is the big elephant in the room when we talk about the United States. If the United States today is a deindustrialized superpower, it's because of China. If the United States is struggling on various fronts to establish its leadership, especially in the areas it used to be effortlessly leading, in, particularly digital technology, artificial intelligence, so all of these things that's lagging behind. They've just started to realize they're lagging way behind. So it's not even a Sputnik moment, it's like much bigger than a Sputnik moment. So I think a lot of the politics of Europe and America is today, at least indirectly, being determined by China's moves and China's policy. So in that sense, we are now truly inhabiting a global history. And that's why I keep saying decolonization was the big event of the 20th century. So today, all these ideas about Western liberalism, totalitarianism are falling apart because they did not actually consider the experience of colonialism and of decolonization. They were just based upon this very parochial reckoning with the Soviet Empire, with Nazism, and it couldn't really see beyond. And then again, the failure to reckon with Israel, the failure to reckon with Jewish supremacism, with an expansionist Zionism. All this is part of this larger intellectual failure.
Allà, sisplau.
Bona tarda, gràcies per aquesta conferència. Jo, quan vaig llegir el seu llibre fa uns mesos, vaig trobar molt interessant la seva perspectiva del que està passant a Israel, del que va passar des del 1948, dintre del que és el racisme. I els palestins són els negres d'aquí, són els indis d'allà, i aquesta perspectiva realment la vaig trobar il·luminadora, i penso que avui vostès s'han referit. D'altra banda, el que està passant és terrible i ens sentim impotents. Jo no sé realment què hem de fer. L'esperança amb el jovent, permetin que la posi una mica en dubte. Al nostre país, Espanya, a les enquestes d'opinió, l'opció d'extrema dreta és la preferida entre les persones de 18 a 35 anys. D'acord? A Catalunya tenim una nova extrema dreta perquè pensàvem que n'estàvem fora i no ho estem. D'acord? això sí, vestida de no sé quines coses. El que està passant als Estats Units és terrible perquè estan diguem-ne, destruint la democràcia. Vostè ha fet una diatriba terrible contra Occident i contra Estats Units. Li haig de dir que m'ha semblat un pèl excessiva. Jo em considero occidental i penso que algunes de les coses que van passar aquí després de la guerra, tot el que va fer la socialdemocràcia no marxista a Alemanya, als països escandinaus, a Àustria, doncs és una cosa molt valuosa, al Regne Unit. I sobretot m'ha semblat que el seu resum del que era el segle XX està totalment desequilibrat i no del tot honest. És a dir, quan vostè parla de Solzhenitsyn, de Milos, als quals he llegit, si un llegeix l'arxipèlag Gulag de Solzhenitsyn, se n'adona de la terrible tragèdia que va patir el poble rus. De la terrible tragèdia. I molt aviat, el 36 va haver-hi les grans purgues on 1 milió de persones innocents acusades de crims que no havien comès van ser assassinades. Abans del 32, Stalin va fer morir de gana a 4 milions de persones a Ucraïna perquè els hi negava el blat. Ucraïna, la terra més fèrtil al graner d'Europa. Els milions de morts que hi va haver, els camps soviètics no eren unes màquines mecanitzades de matar com els nazis, però a molts llocs de Kolimà, etc., l'esperança de vida era de 3 mesos, perquè entraves allí amb unes temperatures de 20 sota zero sense alimentar. Els crims de la Xina de Mao són incomparables, immensurables, 50 milions de persones. Els crims de la Camboya dels Khmers rojos. Per tant, diguem-ne, aquesta crítica ferotge d'Occident i dels Estats Units, que podria compartir alguns dels seus elements, i considero que els Estats Units de cap manera es pot, diguem-ne, erigir com a virtut de la democràcia i els drets humans, de cap de les maneres. En canvi, l'Europa occidental penso que té més coses que... Quan Arendt va escriure el llibre sobre el totalitarisme, ella igualava nazisme i comunisme, perquè evidentment els extrems se toquen. Hitler va muntar el seu règim amb una absoluta admiració per a Stalin i va voler muntar un règim policial similar al que hi havia a Rússia. I ho va aconseguir, segurament ho va superar, no sé si ho va superar. Però en tot cas em sembla que aquesta manca, diguem-ne, aquesta imparcialitat, manca d'imparcialitat, per mi, diguem-ne, desmereix una mica el seu discurs. I ja dic que he trobat moltes coses interessants.
Thank you. I should say that, you in a way illustrated my thesis, which is that congratulating oneself on the basis that the communist enemy is completely evil is okay. We should do it, perhaps, but not to the extent it was done. That's my point. We should always leave open a lot of scope for self-examination, broaden our historical frameworks a little bit. So instead of going on about Mao or Stalin or the Gulag, let's also look at this broader history of the West in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, the famines, the genocides, the despotism. That is what Hannah Arendt was pointing to. If we are able to look at that, it's not a question of privileging the West over the East, it's a question of opening our minds, liberating them from easy, simplistic oppositions of the kind you've just described, communism versus the free world. That is the root of the problem that I've identified, where we become too complacent in our easy victories. It's too easy. The problem with communism, as Gombrowicz, so many others pointed out, it was too stupid an enemy. It was too criminal, it's too cruel, too corrupt. It was not the kind of enemy that makes you more alert. It made for laziness, and laziness is precisely what I'm pointing to, and saying that this laziness is at the basis of our failure today to understand what has gone wrong in our society. So it's not saying the West is bad. That is not what I'm saying. Please, I'm saying that there are many aspects to a complex entity such as Europe, America. We must not just focus on one aspect of it. I'm saying social democracy, all the things that you mentioned, yes, they are there, but when social democracy comes under threat, how do we respond intellectually? How do we diagnose that problem? It's not enough to sit here in 2025 and say Mao was bad. We've done enough of that. It's time to move on. It's time to say, when we were saying those things, Mao was bad, what did we miss back then? What did we omit? Yes, Mao was bad, and yes, Stalin was evil. What else was going on in the world at that time? So let's not get emotionally invested in either Europe or India or China. Let's sit back a little bit and see what is how are we describing this world? Are there areas of experience? Are there perspectives that we have taken into account? And if not, let's bring them into account. Let's see what picture emerges from that kind of inclusion.
Si hi ha una pregunta més, serà l'última ja.
Gràcies. En primer lloc, agrair el llibre il·luminador del senyor Mishra sobre Gaza, que és un llibre necessari, només volia dir això, i també la conferència d'avui. Però voldria saber la seva opinió sobre una cosa que a mi em preocupa últimament molt, trobats com ens trobem uns temps terrorífics, i és la gènesi del moment actual a nivell polític, perquè jo la situo com una evolució del neoliberalisme, aquest monstre que va néixer fa 50 anys i que va esclatar fa als anys 90, i que ara, jo em pregunto si vostè creu, perquè jo no ho tinc clar, perquè em fa dubtar, no tinc clar què està passant. No sé si el triomf de l'extrema dreta, d'aquesta postdemocràcia que estan proclamant com una festa, és una evolució volguda, una metamorfosi volguda del neoliberalisme, o és un fill bord del neoliberalisme, que el neoliberalisme evidentment és una condició necessària perquè ha destrossat la societat i ha fet possible que el discurs de l'extrema dreta fàcil, cridaner, digerible, tan fàcil, si això és una cosa aprofitada o és una cosa buscada. No sé si m'explico. No sé si és una transformació buscada del poder que s'amaga darrere el neoliberalisme, aquesta extrema dreta salvatge d'avui dia, o és que ha sortit una bèstia imprevista de les conseqüències del neoliberalisme, que ara el neoliberalisme, el poder, en definitiva, està aprofitant per portar encara més enllà el seu projecte. Jo no ho tinc clar, En tot cas, cap de les opcions és consoladora ni cap de les genera cap mena d'esperança. Cap de les dues, això crec que no. I només un apunt, jo crec que Hannah Arendt, al llibre sobre totalitarisme, diu moltes coses, però diu que l'origen del totalitarisme, tal com ha assenyalat el senyor Mishra a l'inici de la seva intervenció, és el salvatge imperialisme europeu. Perquè els europeus fem moltes coses, però al segle XIX, molt amagat, com ha dit 2 o 3 cops el senyor Mishra, amaga moltes coses, però l'imperialisme és l'origen del totalitarisme. Bauman deia que la modernitat era condició necessària de l'Holocaust, en el seu fantàstic llibre, però és que l'origen es trobava, l'origen pràctic dels genocidis, de l'extermini, el teníem els europeus 60-70 anys abans de Hitler. Era el model, clarament era el model. I el model també racista era el mateix. Gràcies. No sé, espero que m'hagi explicat a la pregunta sobre el neoliberalisme perquè tinc molt interès de saber la seva opinió. Gràcies.
Thank you. I think let me take the neoliberal part. I think the sort of intolerable conditions created by this mode of neoliberal economy are such. The extreme inequality, destruction of public services that we've seen in places like the UK and the US, where public services were small to begin with, and France, of course. I think that kind of intolerable condition of ordinary citizens, which cannot be addressed by normal democratic politics, increasingly they are powerless, dysfunctional, compromised, corrupted by the same mechanisms. Obviously, I think the thing that will give neoliberalism a precarious lease of life at the very moment of its universal discrediting is the far right. It's the far right that knows how to identify new enemies for the people, of the people, and keep the people busy with those enemies while the neoliberals clean up and the far right also gets a share of the pile, which is what we're seeing in the United States very clearly today. You look at the big corporate bosses prostrating themselves before Trump, openly supporting what his crackdowns on civil liberties, freedom of speech, and I think they've decided this is our man, at least for the next 3 years, or maybe he will actually do away with democracy altogether, with elections altogether, and so we must support him. Likewise, you see in the UK, the culture shifting to the far right. Powerful people deciding who should be prime minister, choosing that person, empowering them through money, through networks. It's quite extraordinary because it's now out in the open. These sort of things used to happen behind the scenes, but now it's brazenly public. So I don't think there's any mystery about what is happening today, where neoliberalism has been diagnosed, has been identified as essentially something that makes a tiny minority grotesquely rich and, basically degrades the living conditions of everyone else. But how does it survive? Because it's so entrenched and there are no alternatives in sight. The left alternative was destroyed a long time ago. It was delegitimized. And so there you are then, what Calvino said, totalitarian structure of a medieval kind, techno-feudalism, as Varoufakis calls it, with no hope of escape or release. So, sorry, what was the other thing you mentioned about, or maybe I'll... Yes, I mentioned that in its sort of 19th century origins, going back to the earlier question, like that link is important. People don't talk about that. People don't even talk about the first part of that book because it's not relevant to most people to think about the Asians and Africans suffering under imperialism back in the 19th century.
Una última de propina, una última pregunta, però que sigui breu, sisplau.
Thank you, Mr. Mishra, for such number of I will say, brave ideas. I'm going to turn into Catalan for the question. It's about the comparison between you said, televised extermination, right, versus hidden holocaust. Em sembla que és una imatge molt poderosa que ens ha transmès, no? Aquesta idea que separa dos moments terribles, un segle d'història i víctima i victimari, entre la idea d'un holocaust que es va fer quasi d'amagat versus una voluntat explícita, no? Desvergonyida, d'evidenciar el mal, que deia el Josep, aquesta continuïtat. Clar, hi ha continuïtats però hi ha elements diferencials. I em plantejava, no sé si podria anar una mica més enllà, en si el que diferencia una manera de fer de l'altra potser no és tant acusar uns estats o uns altres com traslladar la responsabilitat d'una superioritat dels estats cap a una superioritat de la tècnica, de la tecnologia, del capitalisme en si mateix, que es mostra desvergonyit, com ho fa Trump, com ho fan antics líders que ja han sortit del govern, etc., versus una espècie de superioritat continguda dels estats al llarg del segle XX. Em sembla perillós acusar Israel, els jueus, els ciutadans, ni van tenir gaire culpa ara ni fa un segle. Crec que el focus hauria d'estar en qui i com exerceix i de quina manera aquest sentit de superioritat.
No, it's a line of thought that I've only recently started to pay attention to, and tentatively, because this is a very dangerous area. But I think already what is clear is that the relish in cruelty, in humiliation, shown by not only the Israeli soldiers, but by the Israeli media class, by their mainstream television channels, by the news reporters, and by the society at large. Let's not forget that you have overwhelming support in Israel today for what is happening in Gaza. I think that kind of consensus before a live-streamed genocide, where you see horrific pictures of the kind, human beings have never been exposed to certain images of cruelty and moral destitution. I don't want to mention these images, but I think it's safe to say that there is some threshold has been reached in our capacity to absorb these atrocities on a daily basis. I think psychologists over the next few decades will spend some time thinking about what effect it has had on our minds and souls, this kind of prolonged exposure. But the same exposure among the Israelis, or many of them at least, doesn't produce shame, it produces these other emotions, which is pride in the capacity of Mossad or IDF to unleash that kind of murderous violence, not just against the Palestinians, Iran, Syria, Lebanon. It's sort of exulting. It's like, look at these explosions, and people, not only in Israel, but also their supporters in the United States, kind of enjoying the spectacle of violence. So in that sense, I think it's a different kind of mass extermination. Obviously, the scale of the Holocaust is very different, and the kind of fiendishness of the planning and organization. But what I'm still struck by is that the Nazis, that famous speech by Heinrich Himmler, where he's telling the SS about what they're about to do and saying how difficult it is, and that they will be admired for coming through it, having done what they're doing. So in that speech, he's still appealing to some idea of emotional and mental distress that human beings feel in committing those kinds of atrocities on other human beings, and saying, look, you are so great that you came through all that. I think in the rhetoric of Israeli politicians today, I see no trace of that kind of recognition of humanity. I find it really almost impossible to write about this, but I'm absolutely stupefied by the degree of humanity that has been on evidence in the last two years now. And again, I think it's and the proximity of the victim to the executioner, all of that is again sort of creating a reservoir of emotion, which I don't know whether it can be turned into thought very quickly, because I think this is something new, some new territory altogether that's been opened up, and we don't have the means yet to explore it at this point. We can still only keep pondering it, but certainly I think modern political evil has shown us a side that we hadn't seen before. And I think we certainly did not see it during the Holocaust and after the Holocaust.
Molt bé, moltes gràcies. Ho deixem aquí i ens veiem la setmana que ve. Moltes gràcies.